He blew up rocks for a living and built dreams out of rust. Mike Hall was the kind of man who didn't just live life, he attacked it head on. To most people, he was that wild-haired Canadian with the unstoppable laugh, racing deadlines in a scrapyard filled with hundreds of forgotten cars. But behind the camera of Rust Valley Restorers, Mike was more than just a reality TV personality. He was a man chasing something bigger, the dream of breathing life into the past, one bolt at a time. He was the Rasta Blasta, a guy who built a legend out of grit, horsepower, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Yet while we watched him resurrect classic cars on Netflix, few realized the real story unfolding behind the scenes. The one filled with sleepless nights, mounting debts, and the heartbreaking question of how long a dream can survive when it stops making sense. So when news spread that Mike was suddenly auctioning off his entire collection, hundreds of cars, gone in one weekend, fans everywhere asked the same question. What really happened to Mike Hall? Mike's journey started far from the noise of his iconic yard. Born in 1956 in St. Boniface, Manitoba, he didn't grow up surrounded by wealth or opportunity. What he did have, though, was curiosity, the kind that makes a young boy take apart a toy car just to see how it works. His father worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway, and when the family eventually moved to Kamloops, British Columbia, everything changed. Kamloops wasn't a glamorous city, but for a young kid surrounded by the roar of engines and the smell of gasoline, it might as well have been paradise. This was the 1960s, when cars weren't just machines, they were statements of freedom, rebellion, and raw power. Mike grew up obsessed with that feeling. He didn't just like cars. He studied them, admired them, and dreamed of the day he could call one his own. By the time he was 20, that dream had already taken shape. He wasn't just collecting cars. He was rescuing them, saving pieces of history that others had forgotten. But before cars became his livelihood, Mike made his name doing something entirely different and far more dangerous. He founded Chimera Springs Rockworks, a company specializing in rock scaling and blasting. It was hard, nerve-wracking work, hanging off cliffs, drilling into solid stone, and setting off controlled explosions to keep highways safe from rock slides. Most people would call it insane. For Mike, it was just another day at the office. He had that mix of fearlessness and precision that made him perfect for the job. Over the years, Chimera Springs became one of the most respected rock stabilization companies in British Columbia. The money was good, and Mike earned every cent of it. But anyone who knew him also knew exactly where that money went, straight into his growing car collection. As his rock-blasting jobs took him all over the province, Mike began discovering old treasures on the side of dusty roads, forgotten muscle cars, vintage pickups, and the occasional gem rusting quietly in someone's backyard. Most people saw scrap metal. Mike saw stories. Every car had a past, and every dent told a story worth saving. He would buy them on impulse, sometimes from small-town farmers, sometimes from junkyards nobody cared about anymore. He'd haul them back however he could, trailers, dump trucks, anything with wheels. The cars started piling up. At first it was just a handful, then a dozen, then dozens more. Eventually, Mike bought a 26-acre farm just to store them all. The property quickly turned into a monument to his obsession. Hundreds of classic vehicles stretching across the fields like a steel forest of the past. But as much as Mike loved his collection, it began to take a toll on his personal life. His wife, understandably, wasn't thrilled about living in what was slowly turning into an automotive graveyard. She told him the farm couldn't double as a junkyard anymore, not if they wanted any kind of peace. Mike, being Mike, didn't argue. Instead, he found a loophole. He bought a new 5-acre property in Tappan, a quiet area near Shuswap Lake, perfectly zoned for auto wrecking. It was a dream setup, and dangerously enabling for a man like him. The property sat right next to the White Post Auto Museum, and before long, Mike had struck a deal to store some of his cars there as well. One by one, the field filled with hundreds of classics, Mustangs, Camaros, and forgotten Canadian models that hadn't seen the road in decades. To Mike, it was heaven. To his family, it was chaos. By his 60s, Mike had amassed nearly 400 cars. It wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was a full-blown addiction. He'd joke about it in interviews, calling himself a collector with no off switch. But deep down, he knew the truth. The collection had grown too big for one man to handle. The maintenance, the taxes, the constant work, it was overwhelming. Yet even then, he couldn't stop. The thrill of the hunt kept pulling him back. Every time he told himself he'd bought his last car, he'd stumble on another forgotten beauty and start the cycle all over again. As the years rolled on, something else began to creep into Mike's mind, and the question of time. His father had died young, and several of his close friends were dealing with health problems. For a man who'd spent decades hanging from cliffs and dodging flying debris, mortality wasn't an abstract thought. It was real. Mike started wondering what would happen when he was gone. What would his wife and kids do with a property full of decaying steel? Who would care for the hundreds of cars he'd collected over a lifetime? That question hit him harder than any blast ever had. For the first time, he began to think about letting go. In 2016, Mike made a bold move. He decided to sell it all. He listed his 5-acre property, the cars, and everything on it for $119 million. It was more than fair, considering what the deal included: a renovated home, a fully equipped restoration shop, and hundreds of classic vehicles. But to his surprise, no one bid. A year later, he raised the price to $1.45 million, thinking maybe he'd attract a more serious buyer. Still, the phone stayed silent. For most collectors, that would have been a blessing, an excuse to keep holding on. But for Mike, it was frustrating. He wasn't trying to get rich. He was trying to find someone who cared enough to take over what he'd built. Even then, he couldn't resist adding to the collection. By the time he tried selling again, he'd added at least 40 more cars. He couldn't help himself. They lined the fields like a frozen audience, quiet and weathered, waiting for someone to bring them back to life. When a journalist asked him why he was giving up the thing he loved most, Mike gave a simple, honest answer. "I was planning to restore them all when I retired, but life had other ideas." Around that time, he landed a massive 5-year rock-scaling contract, one that would keep him busier than ever. Retirement, once a tempting idea, got pushed further down the road. It might have ended there, Mike working his blasting jobs, tinkering with cars on weekends, and slowly fading into local legend. But fate had other plans. His sprawling car collection, his eccentric personality, and his relentless drive caught the attention of a production company looking for their next big reality TV hit. What they found in Tappan was pure gold, a scrapyard full of stories and a man who embodied everything viewers loved: authenticity, passion, and chaos wrapped in dreadlocks and denim. That's how Rust Valley Restorers was born. When Rust Valley Restorers first aired, it didn't just introduce viewers to a bunch of old cars in rural Canada, it introduced them to Mike Hall. Instantly recognizable with his dreadlocks, weathered hands, and wide grin, Mike wasn't a made-for-TV character. He was real. What people saw on screen was exactly who he was off camera: passionate, stubborn, and completely addicted to the thrill of restoration. Audiences loved him because he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just a guy with too many cars, too little time, and a heart too big for his own good. Alongside his son Connor and his friend Avery Shoaf, Mike turned what looked like an ordinary scrapyard into one of Netflix's most charming reality shows. For fans, it was about more than just cars. It was about the bond between friends, the clash between business and passion, and the endless pursuit of something meaningful in a world that measures everything by profit. But the truth is, for Mike, Rust Valley Restorers was never really about fame or money. If anything, the spotlight only made things harder. He'd spent years following his gut, not spreadsheets, and now cameras were capturing every messy, unpredictable part of that lifestyle. Behind the laughter and high fives, the math just didn't work. Restoring cars is expensive, incredibly expensive, and Mike was doing it on a scale that defied reason. The show made it look like his business was booming, but in reality, each build was a financial tightrope. The cars were worth saving, but the costs always outweighed the profits. For every gleaming restoration that rolled out of the shop, there were months of unpaid bills, stressed employees, and a man wondering if passion alone could keep the lights on. Mike often joked about how terrible he was at business, but it wasn't really a joke. He knew it. He admitted in interviews that if you looked at his finances, it was a disaster. "I'm not a businessman," he'd say. "I'm a car guy." And that was the heart of his struggle. Rust Valley Restorers wasn't built on spreadsheets. It was built on heart. Mike would take in a wreck that made no financial sense just because he couldn't stand to see it rot away. His employees would tell him to walk away, but he'd just shake his head and say, "We'll figure it out." And somehow they always did, but at a cost. As the seasons went on, the pressure grew. The cameras captured the excitement, but they also caught the exhaustion. The deadlines, the arguments, the late nights. Mike's passion was turning into a grind, and his dream was starting to feel like a burden. The fame didn't help. Suddenly, his quiet corner of British Columbia was swarmed with fans, tourists, and reporters. People would drive hours just to see the legendary Rust Valley. Some would even climb the fence, trying to catch a glimpse of Mike or his cars. What had started as a personal project now felt like a public zoo. Mike tried to keep smiling, but the toll was showing. Then came the part that fans didn't see much of, the financial weight crushing him behind the scenes. The shop was struggling. The restorations took months, sometimes years to finish, and every car sitting half done meant more money tied up in parts, labor, and storage. The show's popularity didn't translate into profit. Even with the global audience Netflix brought, Mike wasn't raking in millions. Most of the revenue went back into the yard, fixing roofs, buying parts, paying staff, keeping the dream alive. But dreams, as Mike would learn, have limits. By 2021, things were reaching a breaking point. Mike was exhausted. The numbers didn't lie anymore. He was losing money fast. The stress, the debt, and the endless responsibility were taking a toll not just on him, but on everyone around him. His son Connor was starting to see it too. The weight of keeping Rust Broers restorations afloat was crushing his father. And then, quietly, without any big announcement, Mike made a decision that shocked everyone. He was done. He loved the work. He loved the fans. But he couldn't keep going the way he was. So he did the unthinkable. He put nearly all his cars up for auction. Over 500 vehicles, spanning decades of automotive history, all going under the hammer. It wasn't just a sale. It was the end of an era. For Mike, each car was a memory, a story of where he found it, why he saved it, what it meant to him. And now, one by one, they were leaving his yard forever. Fans who had followed him for years couldn't believe it. Some thought he was retiring. Others feared something was wrong. But the truth was simpler and more human. Mike was tired. He wanted peace. The auction took place in the summer of 2021, and it was nothing short of emotional. People traveled from across Canada to be part of it. Rows upon rows of cars sat under the open sky. Mustangs, Chargers, Buicks, and trucks, each one carrying a piece of Mike's life. The event drew huge crowds and even bigger emotions. Some buyers came for the deals. Others came just to say goodbye. Mike walked the grounds, talking to fans, watching decades of his passion disappear piece by piece. But he wasn't bitter. If anything, he seemed lighter. For the first time in years, the weight was lifting off his shoulders. When the dust settled, Mike had sold most of his collection. The cars that remained were the ones closest to his heart, the ones he couldn't bear to part with. The auction didn't make him rich, but it gave him something more valuable: freedom. He no longer had to worry about managing a fleet of rusting classics or stretching his finances to the breaking point. He could finally breathe again. After the auction, rumors spread quickly. Some said Mike was retiring for good. Others claimed he was planning a comeback. The truth, as always with Mike, was somewhere in between. He didn't completely walk away from Rust Valley Restorers, but he knew it was time to slow down. In interviews, he said he was proud of what the show had done, not just for him, but for the entire community. Tappan had become a tourist destination. Local businesses had thrived, and for a while, the whole world had fallen in love with the little scrapyard in British Columbia that refused to quit. But even with all the success, the show's future became uncertain. After several seasons, it quietly wrapped up, leaving fans wondering if they'd ever see the crew again. Mike didn't disappear entirely. He stayed active online, sharing updates, posting videos, and keeping in touch with fans who had supported him from the beginning. His trademark humor was still there, but so was a new kind of calm, the peace of a man who'd finally found balance after a lifetime of chaos. For many fans, it's strange to think of Rust Valley Restorers without Mike's laugh echoing through the yard. He was the heartbeat of the show, the reason it worked. He didn't just fix cars, and he brought people together. His friendship with Avery, his bond with his son Connor, and his endless optimism gave the show its soul. And even now, years after the cameras stopped rolling, that spirit lives on. Today, Mike Hall is living a quieter life. He still has a few cars. Of course he does. But he's no longer buried under hundreds of them. He still does small restoration projects when he feels like it, but without the crushing deadlines or financial strain. He spends more time with family, travels when he can, and enjoys the simple things he once overlooked. He's talked about maybe doing another project someday, but only if it feels right. For now, he's just content to watch the sunsets over Shuswap Lake, knowing he built something that outlasted him, not just the cars, but the memories. Looking back, Mike's story isn't about failure. It's about evolution. It's about a man who dared to follow his passion even when it made no sense, and who had the courage to let go when it became too heavy to carry. In a world that tells us success means never quitting, Mike showed us something far more powerful, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop. To look at what you've built, smile, and say, that's enough. And maybe that's why his story resonates so deeply. Because deep down, we all have our own Rust Valley. That dream we pour everything into, that passion that defines who we are. For Mike Hall, it was the roar of engines, the smell of oil, and the satisfaction of saving something beautiful from being forgotten. He turned that love into a legacy, one that will keep inspiring car lovers, dreamers, and everyday people for generations to come. So what really happened to Mike Hall from Rust Valley Restorers? The answer is simple. He didn't disappear. He just finally slowed down, not because he lost his love for the craft, but because he'd already proven everything he needed to. The Rasta Blasta may have put down his tools, but his spirit, that relentless drive to build, restore, and dream, still echoes through every rusted shell he ever saved. Because in the end, Rust Valley was never about the cars. It was about the man who saw beauty in the rust, and Mike Hall will forever be that man.